All right, well, hey everyone, thank you for joining me on the final episode of our 2-year-long series, which is called The Story of All Stories. As we wrap up this series, we're going to take a look at the final 11 chapters of Revelation. If you were able to listen in or watch the video from last week, we tried to unpack the first 11 chapters of this pretty strange letter. We talked about how Revelation has tended to be a deeply misunderstood and often abused letter. There is a strange eagerness to make this letter about things like decoding the mystery of the end times or learning about the great battle, the number 666, and who could potentially be the Antichrist in our world today. You know, it's this commitment to disregarding the historical and theological context of both the first century and ancient Judaism, though, that has caused people to throw their hands into the air at times and either decide, you know what, I don't ever want to venture into this letter, or to feel like we can just never fully know what is happening in this letter. But as we've said countless times, the key to unlocking any of the biblical letters and stories is to try to get into the mind of the people that wrote it. You know, their context, their culture, their understanding of the world around them. I'm currently reading this book that is called The Unseen Realm by a guy named Michael Heiser. And it's a book about recapturing the supernatural worldview of the Bible. And so in the book, Heiser makes the argument that we have largely gotten passages about the spiritual world incorrect because we have been content to interpret those passages through a modern lens. Which, when we do that, it will always lead to confusion because the biblical writers didn't write these letters for us, which I know may come as a hard truth to swallow. But they didn't write these letters for you and me. They wrote them to the people and for the people in their day and their context. Which does then make it hard to understand certain pieces and elements about the Bible if we aren't willing to do the hard work to understand how they saw the world. And so in the case of Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, you know, he would argue that we have to understand their supernatural worldview. And so how they understood things like angels and demons in the spiritual realm, God and his divine counsel, and so much more. And see, Revelation is one of those letters that we simply just, I don't think we can really understand without first understanding the Jewish context and then their worldview regarding things like prophecy or numerology and symbols and so much more, because Revelation is filled with symbolic language. It's filled with metaphors and numbers that mean different things. And then there's so much more that we can't understand unless we look at their worldview. And when we assume that everything Revelation is saying was written to us to give us a set of secret codes to crack, you know, that will help us unlock the mysteries of heaven and then things like the end times, then we will most certainly fail to understand what is happening in Revelation. Because Revelation wasn't written to you and I. It was written to the 7 churches of Asia. And remember from last week, these 7 churches were dealing with their own problems and issues. But it wasn't just to the 7 churches that it was written. It was also written to highlight the nature of suffering and persecution that was happening at the command of a guy named Emperor Domitian, and to remind the Christians of the choice that rested in their hands. And that choice was to either give up on Jesus or to remain faithful to Jesus. And so briefly, what did we talk about in the first 11 chapters last week? Well, there was a ton that we aren't able to rehash here, but a brief overview is that John is receiving a vision from Jesus about the things of God. Both the supernatural and the natural reality of walking with God. And the most important thing that we looked at was the image of Jesus as the slaughtered but alive lamb. Do you remember this image? I mean, it was all over Revelation. Remember, the Jews had this expectation that the Messiah was going to enter into the story of humanity on a horse, carrying a sword, to conquer the kingdoms of the earth and establish an earthly kingdom that Jesus would rule, and that had Israel as the center of that rule. And so obviously the coming of Jesus, who claimed to be and is the Messiah, kind of turned that image upside down a bit. And so John's vision reminded the Jews of this truth. Jesus wasn't the root of David or the Lion of Judah, wielding an army of 144,000 armor-bearing soldiers, as Revelation 4 and 7 will describe. Remember, those terms would have been understood to mean a strong military leader and powerful king who would come to conquer through war and strength. And instead, what John sees in both those chapters is the exact opposite. He sees a slaughtered but living lamb. Now, we mentioned that the slaughtered but living lamb was portraying the resurrected Jesus. Jesus had died, he was slaughtered, but he was resurrected back to life. So then he was still living, right? He still is living. And so this slaughtered but living lamb is showing the very true nature of Jesus' work to bring life and goodness to the world through sacrifice, not the sword. And so instead of just 144,000 people from within the 12 tribes of Israel becoming the army of the Messiah, there's this great multitude that is too large to count from every tribe and language and ethnicity, this giant sea of humanity with the greatest diversity to ever exist, has become the army of the sacrificed lamb, given the power to conquer evil and death, not by modeling strength of power and war, but by modeling what the lamb lived out, which was sacrificial love on behalf of others. If I was to try and sum up the most important things that we saw from the first 11 chapters, the image of the slaughtered but living lamb is it. However, there were quite a few more images that we looked at, namely this idea of the 3 sets of 7. Remember, there was the scroll that was sealed with 7 seals, and the lamb was the only one who could open the scroll. And so we walked through the seven seals, which led us to discuss the 7 trumpets, and we're going to talk in a little bit about the 7 bowls. But honestly, what is the point of the 3 sets of 7? I think the easiest way to sum them up is to say they are telling the story of God's judgment and the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord being the prophesied day from Isaiah when Jesus would come and make all things right, when he will make all things new. And so each set of 7 is telling the same story of humanity, of God's judgment and the day of the Lord from a different angle. And so we ended last week with the 7th trumpet being blown. The foundations of the earth are shaken as God's kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. And so we're going to jump into the final 11 chapters of Revelation today, which incidentally are also the final 11 chapters of the entire Bible. And so we start with chapters 12 and 13, and they begin with this series of signs. And so chapter 12, verse 1 says, "A great sign appeared in heaven." We're not actually going to jump it back into the next and final set of 7s, the 7 bowls, until chapter 16. And so as is the fashion of John's vision through the letter so far, we're going to take a slight detour to show some things that Jesus wanted John to see. And so the first sign that John sees in chapter 12 is of this dragon and a woman. Now, I don't know about you, but I love a good dragon story. When I showed Cyrus and Gabriel this clip of the dragon Smaug from the Hobbit movies, I thought they were going to lose their minds. They thought it was like the coolest looking dragon that they had ever seen. And so dragons are kind of cool, right? People like them, except this dragon is a direct reference to the serpent from Genesis chapter 3. And so this dragon then attacks a woman and her seed, and the woman and her seed represent the Messiah and his people. The Messiah defeats the dragon and casts him down to earth, which is an interesting thing to consider. Growing up, I would sometimes hear things like Satan was a fallen angel from heaven who decided to disobey and rebel against God, so then God cast him down to earth and he became Satan. And I'm honestly not 100% sure where this line of thinking originated, but I know Revelation 12 has something to do with it. But this is not an image of Satan rebelling and being cast out of heaven. There is a lot more that's taking place to symbolize something far more important in this chapter 12. And so what is it? Well, there is this battle that does ensue between the dragon and the Messiah in heaven, and the Messiah does defeat the dragon and cast him to earth, where then the dragon begins to inspire people on earth to rise against the followers of the Messiah. And see, the symbolism here isn't trying to show that the dragon or Satan lived in heaven and then didn't because of his defeat, but rather that through the Messiah's death and resurrection, the Messiah defeated the dragon in the spiritual heavenly realm, and all that the dragon has left to then work on is to battle against the people on earth. But the people on earth will conquer the dragon by resisting its influences through the power of the Messiah and his work. And I find this really fascinating because to me, John, I think, is trying to show that the real enemies are not people on earth. See, there are real spiritual forces behind the evils in the world, and Jesus' people are given the power to conquer the dragon through the blood of the Lamb. And then so in chapter 13, we see another sign, and this time with two beasts that emerge. The first beast represents military power and strength, power and control through war and force, things like that. And the second beast represents the use of force and control through economics. You can see this in the way that the beast was able to control the buying and selling of goods of the people through the mark of the beast. They were required to get the mark of the beast on their hands and their foreheads in order to access the economic system that was in place. And so this is where things get really strange. And I think it gets strange not for the people who would have read this at the time after John wrote it, but simply for people like us, 2,000 years removed. And so the mark of the beast was the number 666 and would have shown the allegiance of that people to the beast and his ways. And again, for decades and generations, we have misinterpreted this image and number in our modern world. A simple Google search will reveal that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of opinions on what people think this mark of the beast, the number 666, represents. I've heard that it represents things from presidents, the UN, different medical breakthroughs, and basically whatever people are most adamantly opposed to in life. See, but to me, this flippant and nonsensical abuse of something obviously directly connected to ancient cultures and contexts is how people end up using this number and idea as a fear tactic to control and manipulate. It's nothing short of a true logical fallacy to use this number in this way. You know, I am teaching Sydney's logic class to her this year, and we're walking our way through the variety of logical fallacies that people use in argumentation. Forming meaningful arguments are based on facts and statistics and, logic to strengthen and create validity of a point that leads then to a conclusion. However, in every aspect of our humanity, we throw in the occasional or frequent logical fallacy which invalidate our argument because they don't follow the laws of good argumentation. One such category of logical fallacy is called the appeals to emotion, and it covers a variety of fallacies trying to strike at the heart of our emotions, things like fear or pity or mob appeal, snob appeal, and so much more. And see, the use of the number 666 and the mark of the beast to discredit people and ideas is the most egregious appeal to fear that a person can make. It's one of the greatest fallacies in argumentation, and people weaponize things like the mark of the beast to attack anybody, any person, and what they think. When people disagree about something theologically or politically or socially, the easiest thing in the world to do is to claim that they are the Antichrist or have the mark of the beast. The hardest thing is to form a logical argument to validate your position. And so to claim that 666 or the mark of the beast represents presidents that we don't agree with, or medical breakthroughs that we don't like, or political organizations that we think are doing things wrong, is to miss the point of what this passage is describing. And so first, the mark of the beast, or 666, was to be placed on the hands and the forehead, and would have been in direct opposition to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the Shema, where God tells his people to bind the laws of God on their hands and their head. Basically showing that God's people would be consumed by the presence of God at all times. So it's not an arbitrary symbol that John is making up. It is trying to show the contrast between allegiance to God and allegiance to the beast or the dragon. But what does the number 666 actually mean then? I think to really understand this, we have to understand the idea of numerology, which is simply the study of numbers and their meanings. And that may be, honestly, just a bit too simplistic of a meaning. The more complicated way of understanding numerology is that it basically says that all numbers have meaning and they help reveal something, either about yourself or about the world around you. And so directly related to Scripture and the ancient Jewish context, however, numbers spelled things out. Literally, they spelled things out. Ancient cultures could count out people's numbers and ideas about them using their names. The ancient historian Suetonius had an insult that he would use, and he said, "Count the numerical values in the letters of Nero's name, and in murdered his own mother, and find their sum to be the same." In other words, Suetonius was saying that numerologically, you could predict that Nero murdered his own mother simply by adding the numbers of his name together and by adding the numbers of the phrase, murders his own mother. Using people's names to calculate their number was a much more common thing in John's time than it is in ours. And so after John says that the mark of the beast is the number 666, he then says you can calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. And so in other words, John never intended for the number 666 to be synonymous with the devil himself, or even with an evil to be feared in the same way that you see it in those horror movies that use that number today. Instead, when you calculate the number of the beast, you will get the number 666, which is the same as the number of a man. But who is the man in question? So John obviously knew Greek and Hebrew quite well, and he knew that Hebrew letters also represented numbers. And if you write the words Nero Caesar and beast in Hebrew, the number for both of those comes to 666. So yes, John is saying Nero was one of the fulfillments of this vision of the beast. But I don't think he was saying that only Nero was the fulfillment of the vision of the beast and his number. Because you have to remember that John is using symbolism from all over the Old Testament in this letter in Revelation. And so if you go back and you look at Daniel chapters 7 through 12, Daniel lays out a similar vision where the pattern is that the nations used militaristic power and economic strength to demand allegiance from the people and set themselves up as gods to the people. False gods for sure, but gods nonetheless. See, it seems more likely that John is pulling from the pattern that Daniel laid out centuries before this moment to say that Nero was just a living example of what this pattern looked like in his day that will continue then until Jesus returns. Babylon was the beast in Daniel's day, then Persia and Greece followed, and Rome in John's day, and it will continue on with every subsequent earthly kingdom that abuses military and economic strength to portray themselves as gods, forcing people into an allegiance through coercion, control, abuse, and injustice. I don't believe, though, that John is concerned with us trying to figure out which kingdoms have done these things in the past or in the present or who will in the future. I think he's trying to show these churches that this reality of kingdoms will last far beyond what they were experiencing in that moment. Not as a way to cause fear in them, but as a way to give them hope in a Messiah who sees and understands their situation and will stay with them and provide a way through no matter who is causing the disorientation to occur. Which is exactly what happens in the very next chapter, in chapter 14, where we again see the slaughtered but alive lamb, which we now know is Jesus, standing on a mountain with his people. And they all begin to sing this brand new song, calling all people out of their allegiance to the beast and into what he calls the eternal gospel. And so this leads to a scene in the second half of chapter 14 where there are two different harvests taking place. The first is a harvest of grain, which are God's people who are harvested to God's presence. And the second harvest is the harvest of grapes, which represent humanity's evil, which will be trampled and stamped out in the end. And so again, John is presenting a choice to the people. Resist Babylon and follow the Lamb, or follow the beast and suffer its defeat. And so finally, John gets back to the final set of seven, the seven bowls, and these are God's judgments on the earth. You know, in the previous two sets of seven, we saw how some people repented and turned to God and others didn't. And so the seven bowls continue on the plagues from Egypt. And then finally this sixth bowl, the sixth bowl is poured out, and the dragon and the beast gather all the people of the earth for this great battle at a place called Armageddon. Now, if you're my age, then immediately you think of Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck going to this giant meteor to save the earth when you hear the word Armageddon. But to the Jews, they would have known this place, Armageddon, to be a very real place in northern Israel. See, again, the lens that we use when we hear certain things will cause us to think about things differently from people who lived 2,000 years ago. You know, some people believe this section in Armageddon, this last battle, to portray a very real battle that will take place at the end of times, while others see it as a symbol of a time when God will wage war against the evil of the earth. Now, however, this is being directly pulled from Ezekiel 38 and 39, where God sends his ultimate justice on the rebellious nations. And it's this justice that is then being unleashed from the seventh bowl, ushering in once again the day of the Lord, where his ultimate justice comes on the earth. And so that wraps up the content of the scrolls. Remember, John sees the unopenable scroll all the way back in chapter 4. The Lamb is able to open the scroll, and everything that we have looked at is contained in the scroll. The three sets of seven and so much more that we've looked at. And so then the rest of Revelation goes back to discuss three ideas that were previously discussed about in Revelation. And so the first is the fall of Babylon, the second being the final battle, and then finally this idea of the New Jerusalem. And each one of these looks at the coming of God's kingdom from a different angle. And so first is the fall of Babylon. And the entire vision is using language and symbols that were used throughout the Old Testament to describe the fall of Babylon, the fall of Tyre, and the fall of Edom. And so in other words, John is showing how Rome is simply a new Babylon. That Rome's military and economic power was the new version of an ancient pattern of humanity's rebellion against God. See, these nations exalt their military and economic power as a false god. And to me, this is a way that John was saying that this is a part of the human condition that Jesus has come to restore and redeem. That Babylons, this metaphorical Babylon, will come and go until the day of Jesus' return when he sets up his new kingdom. And so John then answers a question that we all feel at this point. How will then Jesus' kingdom come? And John takes us back to the sixth bowl when the nations wage war in the last battle. The final countdown as it was. Jesus comes riding in on a white horse wearing a cloak soaked in blood with a sword sticking out of his mouth. And I have to be honest, this part of the vision stumped me a bit. For the entire letter of Revelation, Jesus has been showing John how the Messiah was expected to be this warrior king entering in on a horse, conquering nations through war and force. And every time this image emerges, Jesus then causes John to see the truth of the Messiah, which is the opposite of the expectation. Because John sees the slaughtered lamb, the slaughtered but living lamb. We've talked about this image all over as a way that John was being shown the reality of the Messiah conquering evil through sacrifice, not war. And yet here we have Jesus entering in the exact manner that people anticipated, but the rest of Revelation was trying to flip on its head. And so what do we make of this new image of Jesus? I read a lot of commentaries, and most of them talked about how the blood was the blood of the enemies of Jesus struck down by the sword of Jesus. So they use this image to say that the expectation of Jesus as the warrior king hacking away at people is accurate. But not only does this not feel right about what we know of who Jesus was, the rest of Revelation would say that that line of interpretation is wrong or misguided. It's poor reasoning to just dismiss example after example in the same letter that shows the Messiah to be the slaughtered but living lamb who sacrificed himself on behalf of all people, not the one who slaughters and say, "Aha, see? Here is the example of Jesus on the horse with the sword destroying his enemies." So then what is happening? I believe this is showing that the last battle, the day of the Lord, which is all a symbol for the day of Jesus' return when he will set all things right, that Jesus will destroy evil on that day. And he will destroy wickedness, but he will do it through his sacrifice. Notice, Jesus comes on a white horse, and behind him are his people also wearing white, except Jesus' cloak is soaked in blood, and the rest of the people's clothes are clean. And see, at this time, white would have represented victory, as if Jesus will come on that day wearing the victory that he has already claimed in heaven against the beast. See, how did that victory come about? It came about through his sacrifice, his death on the cross. Also, notice that Jesus' clothes are soaked in blood before the fight even begins. Why is that significant? Because to me it says that Jesus and his people were clothed in victory before the final battle ever actually began. So how is that possible? Because the battle was fought earlier between Jesus and the dragon in heaven, and Jesus secures his victory through his sacrifice, through the shedding of his blood. See, I think Jesus is riding the victory he already claimed in heaven, and the blood is his own blood. Which is why the people are wearing clean clothes, because they do not have to spill their blood for victory, because Jesus has done so on their behalf. And so the battle then that ensues is to destroy the beast and his evil in the world. And so this victory ushers in 1,000-year reign of Jesus from chapter 20, which, people have argued about this for generations. Some people see this as a literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus, while others see it as a symbolic, a symbol of Jesus' current reign and his present victory over evil. Either way, Jesus is showing that a time will come when people who choose to deny Jesus as king will be given over to that choice. But on that day, Jesus will restore and make all things new. And so the book concludes with a vision of the new heaven and the new earth. This angel shows John a bride, which is the bride of the Lamb, that symbolizes the new creation that has come to live with God forever. God says he has come to make all things new. And in this section, he talks a lot about several Old Testament concepts and promises. He says there will be a new heaven and a new earth where injustices and pain and evil are wiped away. He says there will be a new Garden of Eden where God's family, both spiritual and physical, will dwell together before God. He says there will be a new Jerusalem where the nations of the earth work together and live in peace and harmony before God. And then he says that all creation will be the temple of God. And remember, the temple was God's dwelling place on earth. It was the place of his presence. And so, in the end, everywhere will be the place where God's presence lives forever. And so that's the book of Revelation. It's important that you know that I don't have all the answers for what is happening in this letter. And the goal has not been to make sense of everything, rather to give some kind of understanding as to the structure and maybe shed some light on what is going on. But I don't have all the answers. And so what do we do with this? It's a question that we ask of every story and letter that we read from Scripture. What does this have to do with me? What does it have to do with Seattle or with Missio? Because yes, we certainly believe that the stories of Scripture were written to specific contexts and people and cultures, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't also have a purpose for us. So how do we use Revelation for our context and story? Well, I think there are a number of ways that we can do this. First, I think Revelation shows us that no matter the context or situation that we are experiencing in life, we have two very basic choices that we can make. We can either choose to allow the challenges to cause us to walk away from Jesus, or we can choose to be faithful even when we don't fully understand how or what it looks like to be faithful. You know, the Christians in the first century dealt with incredible persecution and incredible challenges. They would regularly, I'm sure they would have regularly asked questions like, is this worth it? Is faith in Jesus worth the challenges that come along with it? Which I think is a valid question to be asking. You know, one of the reasons that I love looking at the book of Acts is that it shows what it looks like to walk in a community of faith with the people around you, no matter the struggle or challenges that we're all facing. And so you read things in Acts like they gave up possessions to help one another. They prayed for each other. There was this sense that they were emotionally and physically and spiritually involved in the lives of that community of faith, which to me says that I don't have to navigate the reality and the struggles of life alone. I don't have to, because not only do I have Jesus with me, I have a community of people who would sacrifice so much to be near me and to walk with me. You know, in my suffering, in my challenges, in my pain or heartbreak, and so much more, a community of faith can help you navigate those moments. Second, Revelation dispels the notion of Jesus being war-yielding and power-hungry, king looking to use his strength to force people into submission. Instead, all over Revelation, we see Jesus as the slaughtered but living lamb who, by his sacrificial love, fought for the hearts of humanity. Third, Revelation shows me there is more happening that the physical evil that I see in the world can't necessarily show. That when we see terrible things, we can be certain that there is a spiritual battle that's also waging. But it isn't one that I have to feel like I need to be worried about, because Jesus has done all that needs to be done for me. So honestly, all I have to do is trust in following him. So fourth, there is no secret code or hidden knowledge for me to unravel or crack in order for me to participate in the great battle or the end times or whatever it is that we normally look at in Revelation. Instead, where my concern needs to be is to be in walking faithfully with Jesus. And then finally, we trust in the end that Jesus will return in victory to make all things new. And until then, our calling is to live into that sacrificial model, that sacrificial love that was modeled by Jesus, to seek people out, to share the story of hope that comes with knowing and walking with Jesus. So thank you all for being a part of this series these last 2 years with us. From Genesis to Revelation, we have looked at the story of God, and we have seen a good God that loves us enough to send his Son to be sacrificed, to be the sacrifice that was needed for us to be with him. You know, and that's a beautiful story. It honestly helps me know my own walk with God and the challenges that I have and will undoubtedly continue to face. But see, with him, it all makes sense. I love you all. I am grateful that I get to be in community with you, and I will see you this Sunday at the Nexus Hotel for our Friendsgiving lunch that will start at 11 o'clock. Bye, everyone.